have low turnout, and there are still huge swathes of the population that are unengaged and aren't participating and whose voices aren't heard. And if that's why we're one of the reasons why people are unhappy with Westminster, because first past the post means that we're only listening to swing seats and we're only listening to seats where, people can change the party political, and if you're in a safe seat, no one cares, then why aren't we more interested in how we properly engage with those people in Scotland who, regardless of our improved voting system, aren't being heard at all?
Well, one idea on that might be, this is just a theory, I'm not saying I necessarily believe it, but you could make the case that for a long time the media have belittled Holyrood as much as possible, particularly at the national level. It's a sideshow and it's not particularly important, and therefore people feel that it's not where things really happen. I mean, with your job you'd know better. The more people vote in Scotland for a UK general election than do for a Holyrood election, I think.
Yeah, they do. Unfortunately, I think that's a historical thing, that people see it as being more important because of the historical lineage, that they've done it for a lot longer, because there's definitely a habit of voting. And we have to remember we're still quite young as the Scottish Parliament. And I think also there's the national media coverage, which is really hard, because the coverage of a general election will always be quite vibrant and persuasive, that you can generally make a difference and it's going to be really tight, so you better get out and vote. Whereas the coverage of Scottish parliamentary elections tends to be quite limited to the Scottish media rather than that national media. I mean, it's even more of a problem in Wales, bless them, where they hardly have any national media, sort of regional media, I suppose you'd call it. So turnout in Welsh parliamentary elections is very low.
Can I just move on to a couple of the others? Mm-hmm. And I'll leave one for last because it will take us neatly to our next story. But I think everyone will agree with the idea of, or almost everyone will agree with the increased openness and transparency in a register of lobbyists.
Or you'd be surprised.
But there's been so much talk consistently about a register of lobbyists. Why is it not coming up, Andrew?
Well, I do know that it's the Labour now Shadow Health spokesman, I think, isn't it, Neil Findlay, that was bringing all of this up. I mean, I suppose people would say that there may be technical questions about who counts as a lobbyist, and if I bump into Nicola Sturgeon in the south side of Glasgow and say to her, Nicola, have you considered X, Y, and Z? I don't know if I would count as a lobbyist in that context. But it's actually funny, although the story about the Scottish Parliament is one that is much more transparent than Westminster has been historically, and there are ways in which this is true. There are other areas in which Holyrood's activities are much less transparent. I'll give you one wee example. The people that MSPs employ are nowhere published online. And it's often quite interesting to find out which councillor, which party apparatchik is employed by this MSP or that one. In Westminster, you can find out, and their staff are required to make sort of declarations about their own interests in outside businesses and whatever. And sometimes they're dispatched to MPs from rather curious organisations to work for them at the expense of the other organisations. Holyrood doesn't do that. So I think it's one of the problems about having a political system which is quite preening and quite pleased with itself is that you don't always have the same impetus to change when you get suddenly these waves of things like the lobbying proposals, which so I don't know so much about the specifics of the proposals. Perhaps Juliet would be able to speak to them.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest question is how would you define lobbying and who a lobbyist is? And the bill that Neil Findlay drafted together with ourselves and Unlock Democracy does sort of define it very loosely, but equally it wouldn't include you bumping into Nicola Sturgeon in the street. That would not be lobbying. That would be you bumping into Nicola Sturgeon in the street. It basically sets a sort of minimal amount of how much time and money someone spends on the act of lobbying. What's difficult is there is no perfect system. If everybody was just transparent, that would make life so much easier. And indeed, one of the proposals that's coming out of Democracy Max is why shouldn't that apply across the board to the media and even to citizens as well? And for all that I'm not a massive fan of the Scandic model, the Scandic countries have publicly available tax information on all their citizens. So it's just sort of commonplace for you to know who's paying whom and what income they're getting. But the Westminster proposals are very shoddy in comparison to the proposals in Scotland. They will basically exclude most lobbying firms. The register that works in Europe is, again, a little bit dysfunctional. insofar as people sort of can choose whether or not they're registered. And oddly, the best example is the American example, because for all that they spend huge amounts of money, and it's really quite profligate and gratuitous, they are incredibly transparent about how that works. So
they're also incredibly transparent about not caring about who's not listening to who.
So this is the thing. It's like, obviously there needs to be some kind of then force behind once you've got that exposure and transparency. And I think there's an awful lot of chat about how, well, the forum of public opinion would be sufficient. And you're like, well, I'm not sure that that's the case. And that's where the American example might lead us to say, no, just knowing isn't sufficient. There also has to be some kind of protocol, and I don't want to use the word punishment, but I can't think of this nicer word for it. If you are abusing your role and abusing the way that the system should work and, paying for lobbying. But then it's impossibly difficult. I've always worked for third sector organisations who have struggled to find enough money to lobby and attend party political conferences where people are sitting ducks to be talked to. And then you see people like Coca-Cola and BA Systems with their, executive dinners and all the rest of it. So I think it's really just a case of trying to, and this is what the People's Gathering participants, how they phrased it, was just getting big money out of politics.
Yeah, because one of the interesting parts there of getting big money out of politics, I think that would go hand in hand with what you said about getting rid of party politics. I think those two things would have to go hand in hand. I don't think they're separable.
But what would you do if you didn't have party politics? Well, I'm personally, confession, I'm all for getting rid of party politics, but I have been persuaded by my colleagues that it would be impossible. Just because that's the way people organise. And even if you abandoned it and you disbanded all kinds of political parties, just like we're seeing with the independence debate, people are grouping themselves around like-minded individuals. So you'd wind up with, the equivalent of a National Collective party or the equivalent of a Women For Independence party. So I think that's really, it's saying that, it's in our nature to pull together and to pool resources and to form allegiances, but how do we best manage that? And also, how do we manage the decline in the traditional political party, whether that's membership, as we saw reported in the press this week, or whether it's influence, or whether it's connection to the people, that there's a disconnect between parties and people, but just abolishing parties probably won't fix that disconnect between politics and people.
Is that yeah? I mean, I think that's an interesting point, and there's an interesting maybe undercurrent or a kind of concealed implicit understanding behind the idea that the solution is to abolish political parties, and that would be that all of the diffuse individuals would thereby be strengthened in dealing with wealthy corporate bodies, and I just don't believe that that's true. Actually, it's a kind of, you can maybe even sort of identify it with your classic sort of atomizing neoliberal postmodern. There's a terrifying run of things for you, but that kind of idea that we should all be emancipated as individuals and that sort of collectives are inherently dodgy. Now, I'm not saying that when you look at the way political parties operate, that any of us should sort of have our hearts leaping into our chests. I mean, it's pretty grim, pretty unattractive much of the time, and you can probably add it to Bismarck's statements about law, sausages, and political parties. All of the above are pretty mucky in how they work, and there's internal backbiting, and all of the usual things we find in any actual large or even medium and decreasing scale organisation which comes together. There's bridge clubs that are pretty bruising, though perhaps not quite as bruising as the Scottish Labour Party is.
Just one thing to disagree with there, because I'm not suggesting that individual MPs out with the parties would be uninfluenceable. Of course you could put pressure on them, but it's actually much easier, and it's kind of a principle of the mafia as well and how they used to function, that, if there's one big guy, one party leader, if Rupert Murdoch can go to one party leader and get that party singing the way he wants to, that's much easier than having to go to 360 guys and get all of them to sing to the tune that he wants to. I think that would be a small thing about it.
I think that might be true, but then equally you've got the example of direct democracy and referenda in California that speaks against that, because it shows you that even with citizen-led referenda, so they're allowed to propose a referendum on any issue as long as they get enough signatures, all that's happened is that people have started basically buying enough signatures, and it's again controlled by big money and not controlled by the citizens. The other interesting point that came up, which actually would be my biggest rationale to keep political parties, is that if you move to a more independent system, you completely manage to eradicate any kind of equality across the board, whether it's gender, race, sexuality, whatever, because people who are already struggling don't put themselves forward unless they have the party mechanisms to support them. And we can see that in our independent councillors in Scotland. You can show, I mean, most of our independent councillors are pale, male and stale.
Unlike all of the rest of the councillors, which are, oh yes, much the same.
Well, yes, but the few women that there are have come through the party system, and I think it's a warning signal that if we're going to proceed, we probably have to proceed as a group and with combined effort. That just sort of anarchy isn't going to produce a better political system.
I mean, it seems to me one of these interesting things, just sorry, Michael, a last wee point on that the first point when you're trying to bring people together is to dismantle existing structures that bring people together. That seems kind of an interesting proposition that to me, and maybe this speaks to my my reformist field Jacobinism and lack of radicalism, but I often think, work with what you've got, because you're pretty sure about what you've got already. I mean, maybe there are circumstances which need radical changes, but I think people are so tenuously drawn together as things are. It's one of the reasons why I have sort of some problems with anti-nationalism and from a left-wing point of view, because I think, I understand nationalism can do terrible things and is very Janus-faced in the classic Tom Nairn sense, but it's also one of the key ways that actually brings people together and creates wider kind of senses that I'm interested in my neighbour and beyond, all the way up to the Northern Isles, and I think therefore that it interests me, that kind of idea that what we have to do is dismantle one of the main things that brings us all together, in order to be more together. Anyway, that's just
I would agree, and I would add, try being a feminist. It's a little bit of a shaky ground to be working on. There's feminists who seem to want to undermine other feminists at every turn in the road, and you'd think that we're already put upon enough that we wouldn't need to do it to ourselves.
Just to come to a last part of this, because it leads us neatly on to something, is that one of these things was a rejuvenated, publicly funded media. Now, and I suppose I'll ask Juliet first, why would William McIlvanney think that we need a rejuvenated, publicly funded media this week?
Oh, bless him. I suppose the conversation that we had was that at the moment, especially in Scotland, the control of our media is in a very few hands. So, you've got Scotsman, which is owned by Johnson Power Press. You've got the Herald and Sunday Herald, but they're owned by an American-based company. And then you've got the P&J and their sort of DC Thompson organised local newspapers that they also run. So you're really only hearing from sort of 3 or 4 different voices, and that's if you include the BBC and STV in that mix. So we were just interested in really trying to sort of push the boundaries of if we want to publicly fund the media, if we're saying that media in a democracy is a public good, which we agreed it was, then in the same way that we fund the arts, why wouldn't we fund a broad-based, accountable, transparent public media, so that you could genuinely trust what you were hearing? It wasn't going to be influenced by external forces, and trust was the biggest issue. That how could you trust? And that people seem to trust the BBC because it's publicly funded and not privately funded, and yet we know that the BBC are not whiter than white in any stretch of the imagination.
I thought you were almost going to come out and say not trustworthy, but since you didn't, I will.
Well, certainly a lot of the discussion that we had at that particular round table was around how the BBC have let themselves down institutionally, as well as through how they've broadcast their media and the way that they broadcast their media. It's kind of hard for me to comment because I've sort of stopped watching the news. I find it too depressing, and also just too alienating because it's usually just men shouting at each other. William McIlvanney's statement, it's really interesting to me how it's been reported across the board as being, and I know you wanted to touch on this, that he just didn't know about being invited to maybe write afford to the white paper or be involved in writing the Scottish Government's white paper. And I actually thought there was a lot more of interest